Well, it is good to be back with you here as we are closing out another week on our Bible study as we are walking through the book of Nehemiah. You can find out more about this Bible study by visiting that URL right there at the bottom of your screen, go.christtable.today reconstruct. There is a reading schedule there that will give you all of the readings for the study, and we'd love to have you be a part of it with us 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday. If you'd like to know more about Christ's Table, would love to encourage you to just visit that website right there, www.christtable.today. The only way that we are able to bring these Bible studies and all of these resources to you for free is because of the generosity of those who participate financially with Christ's Table, and we could use you. In return, we send resources directly into your home every couple of months through a spiritual resource box. And so would you consider, if you find this ministry helpful, and if you are participating with us, would you help financially be a part of making these continue on for yourself and for others? Well, thankfully, today we are going to continue on by going to Nehemiah Chapter 8, verses 13 through 18. Now, as we've said, we are on the back side of this book, and the shift in focus has gone from Nehemiah and the wall to now Ezra, who is a priest. And actually, this is kind of Ezra's book. Ezra and Nehemiah, two separate books in our Bibles, were actually one single book. And so started in Ezra, in this book, in the Jewish writings, moved to Nehemiah and focus on him and the wall. And now we're kind of back to Ezra, but we've not heard the last of Nehemiah, so stay tuned. But for now, why don't we just go ahead and dig into the text without any further ado. Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 13 through 18. Let's go. On October 9th, it's kind of fun that we are doing these. If you're watching these live rather than on delay or at some later time, it's fun that we're doing these kind of in tandem in October with all of these dates. And the specificity of the dates is helpful for us because it helps us identify what was going on historically around these events. And so it enables us to bring a lot of wisdom from other places to bear on these things, which is why we're able to get so deeply into the conversation about what was going on and the motivations and the fears and the worries that were real and the fears and the worries that just weren't real. So on October 9th, the family leaders of all the people, and family especially in ancient Israel, but even still in Judaism today, the family and the community are extremely important here in this time period. And in a lot of ways, even today, everything rises and falls on the community. It's not about the individual, it's about the community. Everything hinges on the we, not the me. So the family leaders of all the people, together with the priests and the Levites, these are the religious leaders, meet with Ezra the scribe to go over the law in greater detail. So they have just recently discovered and uncovered the scrolls that have the law of Moses. They have not had access to the verbatim law of Moses up until this point, and so it's just been passed down through generations and through memory, and they realized that the way that they were practicing their faith and living their lives did not really match up with the way that God, through Moses, had said that they were supposed to behave according to the law. And so after finding these things, after reading it to all the people, which was a part of yesterday's study, what we have now here is that they are going to now dig in and go into greater detail as to what was going on. And I love what is about to happen here, because oftentimes whenever, and I'm looking around, my Bible is not laying right here, but whenever we go into greater detail in the Bible, oftentimes as religious people, especially as religious leaders, we're going into greater detail in order to find the things not to do. We're going into greater detail in order to find the problems, in order to identify critiques in order to set stronger and more clear boundaries between what is right and what is wrong. And so anytime you see, somebody who's going into greater detail and greater research into Scripture, almost always what they're doing is trying to identify a negative thing or a negative issue or a constructive criticism. It's rarely these days the opposite. But what I love here is that whenever they go into greater detail, what they actually end up doing and identifying and latching onto is something that is very positive, something that is very affirmative, rather than something that is destructive or demeaning. D words. So as they studied the law in greater detail, they discovered that the Lord had commanded through Moses that the Israelites should live in shelters during the festival to be held that month. So they discovered this old practice that their ancestors used to participate in as part of a festival. A festival implies a celebration. It implies a community event. It implies an opportunity for everybody to gather together for some reason that affects everyone and then participate actively in some sort of celebration related to that. So they realized that as they were digging into this text, there was a old festival that was held at this same time annually, but which none of them had ever participated in, and none of them even remembered was a part of their shared history. So what is this festival? What is this thing? Well, it's called the Feast of Booths. Now, I actually put up the title there because my Midwestern dialect makes it very difficult for me to say the word booths without it sounding like booze, which, let's be honest, there probably was booze there. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it is a great word because depending on whichever word you're saying, it's still kind of appropriate. Now, in your Bible and in your translation, it might actually be called something different. If you were to go back to the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 23, I was looking over here to make sure I got the verses right. Chapter 23, verses 39 through 43. And in Leviticus 23, it's going to talk about this Feast of Booths, and that's exactly what they were looking at when they were going back to the law in greater detail. They were pulling out that scroll of Leviticus and reading it right there, which is the same text essentially that you have in front of you in English, except theirs wasn't in English. It was, there's a dialect. It was in Hebrew. And so in your English translation, though, it may be called the Feast of Booths, or it may be called the Feast of Tabernacles. Either one of those would be appropriate. It might even be called the Feast of Shelters. All of these things are referring to the same word: booth, tabernacle, shelter. It is a temporary structure that is put up for protection from the elements. Imagine building a tree house in the forest as a kid out of sticks and branches and leaves. Imagine building a fort out of these things in order to hide or to protect yourself. This is exactly what they were doing. In the wilderness, they were in a desert region without any structures, and so they would have had to have built these things in order to protect themselves from the elements as they moved through the wilderness from Egypt towards the land of Canaan. And when they got to the land of Canaan, they probably would have immediately built these things before they had more permanent structures. And so these shelters, these tabernacles, these booths were one of the most tangible and meaningful memory tools for ancient Israelites who had actually participated in that. And so whenever they would tell stories about their moving from Egypt into the promised land to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they would tell about these booths. And so it became this thing where they would remember this journey through telling the story and constructing these booths and then living in them for a few days, for a week during the festival as a reminder to them of that journey. And as we've spoken of here and in other studies, memory, remembrance, reminders are key, maybe the key to the Old Testament, to the Jewish faith, and to Yahweh God. It shouldn't surprise us that our continuing meal, communion, is a celebration of remembrance. Take, eat this bread, and do so in remembrance of me. Drink this cup, and do so in remembrance of me. It's about remembering, about active remembrance. And so that's what this festival was. And so they would go and live in these things for a few days or for a week as a reminder, as a celebration of what happened. So they resurrect this practice, and Jewish people still today do this in their backyards this time of year. The Feast of Booths, Tabernacles, Shelters. So Ezra, he had said that a proclamation should be made throughout their towns and in Jerusalem, telling the people, let's do this. Let's resurrect this celebration. Let's go to the hills. Let's get the branches from olive, from wild olive, from myrtle, from palm, and from other leafy trees. And then they were to use these branches to make shelters in which they would live during the festival as was prescribed in law, back there in Leviticus chapter 23. So the people go out, they cut down the branches, they use them to build shelters on the roofs of their houses and in their courtyards and in the courtyards of God's temple or in the squares just inside the water gate and the Ephraim gate. And so these things are everywhere. And I want you to picture in your mind the community in which you live, everybody in your community building one of these things. If you didn't have a backyard, you built it in the front yard for everyone to see. Or maybe you built it in the front yard anyway, just because you wanted there to be community. Lots of people in those days didn't have yards at all. It was like living in row houses in the city. There was no yard whatsoever. Your space was simply your 1 or 2 room living abode, your house. And so where would you build your shelter if you had nowhere to build it? Well, you'd have to build it in some public or community space. And so these things were everywhere, being built by people who still had a lot of questions about God. I mean, these are people that have just come out of captivity, just like their ancestors had just come out of captivity in Egypt as well. And so maybe there was such a desire to build these things because it was a tangible reminder to them that they were not the first. They were not the first people to be held in captivity. In fact, the Egyptian captivity was far longer than the Babylonian captivity. And dare I say, I think the Egyptian captivity was probably far more brutal than the Babylonian captivity. And dare I say, going through the wilderness, all of the things that they experienced, their ancestors, in traveling across Sinai towards the Canaan land, was probably far more difficult than the return back home than the new current Israelites did from Babylonian captivity. Now, it's not to downplay Babylonian captivity, but I think that this celebration was a tangible reminder to them that we've gone through this before, and in many ways it was far worse before, and we survived, and we didn't just survive, but we thrived. And so, yeah, they're going to resurrect this celebration because it's an opportunity for them to say, we can do this. We can make it through what this is. We've got what it takes. And so everybody participates. Everyone who had returned from captivity lived in these shelters during the festival, and they were all filled with great joy. They still had questions about God. They still had questions about why God would allow this. They had questions about how this was redemptive. They had questions about whether or not God could ever be trusted again. They had questions about whether or not the faith that they were participating in, had been raised in, was worth their time and energy. They still had a lot of philosophical and theological and eschatological, that's about end times, questions. But it doesn't prevent them from pausing all of those greater, deeper, larger, and largely unanswerable questions, and just living in the moment and celebrating what is and what they have. Think about that. There were a lot of reasons to not be filled with joy in that moment. There were a lot of reasons that they wouldn't have felt as joyful as maybe they could have. But they pulled together the joy that they could and celebrated with as much fervor as they could muster. And I love this line: the Israelites had not celebrated like this since the days of Joshua. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. But to them, no one in memory or in memories of stories of their parents and grandparents who had soon or had recently passed, no one could remember ever having celebrated like this and being as joyful as this. And no one could remember a parent or a grandparent or a great-grandparent telling a story of ever having celebrated like this. It's beautiful. Ezra, during this resurrected festival, reads from the book of the law of God on each of the 7 days, and then on the 8th day held a solemn assembly as was required by law. And with this, we'll close. I don't pretend to know everything that you're going through. Maybe nobody knows everything that you're going through. We sometimes have a tendency to tell the things that we want to tell and keep other things a little closer to the chest. But you still need celebration. You still deserve joy and happiness. Maybe the things that you are walking through are outside of your control, or maybe the difficulties that you're walking through, that you're facing, are things that were a result of you being out of control and are largely now a result of your own actions. At the end of the day, that was where the Israelites were here as well. They were largely responsible for the situation in which they were. And yet they found joy in God and celebration. And so should you, and so will you. You need regular rhythms of celebration. To me, this is the light bulb moment in this passage, is the necessity to hit pause on the greater questions and the greater struggles in life regularly, so that we may simply, as best we may, celebrate. Don't discount the power of a good festival, of a good party, of a good feast of booze. Until tomorrow.